Africa being a huge continent is not too surprising of a fact. It is, after all, the second largest continent on the planet, covering an area of 11.7 million square miles. And when people think about Africa, most people often think of the mainland itself and Madagascar. But these two landmasses are not the only ones that constitute the continent. Surrounding it are various islands with distinct geographies, biomes, and cultures. And they have all played an important role in Africa's history as well as the shaping of the modern world. But before we dive into this, we first need to categorize these islands. The islands of Africa can be placed into two groups: the Atlantic Ocean Islands and the Indian Ocean Islands. In the Atlantic Ocean, you have the Canary Islands, Madeira, Azores, Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Annobon, Bioko, Ascension Island, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha. In the Indian Ocean, you have Prince Edward Islands, Zanzibar, Crozet Islands, Réunion, Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros, Mayotte, and Madagascar. From the name of these islands, it's evident that a lot of these islands are heavily influenced by Europe, and so these islands can be further grouped into subgroups. This would be islands owned by European countries and islands that are either African countries or controlled by one. Out of the Atlantic Ocean islands, only Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Bioko, and Annobon are African countries or belong to one. The remaining belong to either Britain, Spain, or Portugal. In the Indian Ocean, Madagascar, Comoros, Mauritius, and the Seychelles are the only independent sovereign African countries, with Zanzibar belonging to Tanzania and Prince Edward Island being administered by South Africa. Like the Atlantic, the remaining belong to European countries, mostly the French and the British. This is already an exhaustive list of islands, but it should be noted that these islands are not the only islands surrounding Africa. There are many other smaller islands and archipelagos that are not on this list due to either their proximity or distance from the mainland. It seems obvious in retrospect, but the Atlantic and Indian Ocean islands paint a rather remarkable image of Africa that is seldom talked about due to the overwhelming impact Europe has had on the continent. This image is that of an European-influenced West Africa and an Arabic-influenced East Africa. Before Europeans sailed around the continent and either claimed or colonized everything around it, the islands in the Indian Ocean were within Arabic and Asian sphere of influence. In fact, most of the population on these islands, particularly Madagascar, are a mixture of Africans, Arabic people, Austronesians, and Indians. Most of them arrived to these islands after sailing from their lands in search of a new home, or in the case of the Arabic and Indians, to trade. The Arabic and Indian world heavily traded with the east coast of Africa, and evidence for this can be found not only in historically written accounts by scholars like Ibn Battuta, but also the multitude of settlements that were erected along the East African coast to help facilitate the trade in gold, ivory, crops, and slaves. Some of these settlements, which are now mostly in ruins, include Kilwa in Tanzania and Gedi in Kenya. The Arabs refer to this portion of Africa as Sanj, or Land of the Blacks. In fact, Comoros, an Islamic country, got its name from the Arabic word for moon, and Swahili, the most widely spoken African language, got its name from the Arabic word Swahili, meaning of the coast. Swahili borrows about 15% of its words from the Arabic language, and this serves to highlight the impressive impact the Arabic world has had on Africa well before Europeans. Comparatively, the Atlantic Ocean islands were mostly uninhabited before the arrival of Europeans. This lack of habitation, unlike the Indian Ocean islands, is why Europeans had a much easier time colonizing West Africa and why they were able to scale the slave trade at a higher intensity than the Arabs. Since the Atlantic Ocean islands were mostly uninhabited and extremely fertile, European countries like Spain, Portugal, the British, and the Dutch were able to set up farms and bases on these islands and secure themselves against any hostilities from the mainland. They also used these islands as nodes within the Atlantic slave trade due to their strategic locations between Europe, Africa, and the New World. The islands also became the testing grounds for the use of forced labor to grow cash crops like sugarcane, and they served as the blueprint for the widespread implementation of slave labor in the New World. The population of these Atlantic Ocean islands also reflects European influence, with most of the people on these islands being a mix of African and European ethnicities. The differences between the Atlantic and Indian Ocean islands demonstrates how these islands ended up shaping Africa and the world. If the Atlantic Ocean islands had been previously occupied at the same levels as those in the Indian Ocean, it's very likely European domination of Africa, particularly West Africa, would have been as ineffective as their attempts in the East, which saw massive resistance not just from the local population on these islands, but also from the mainland and Arabic and Indian empires that had a vested interest in keeping the ocean around these islands from being controlled by a foreign entity. It's this very reason why the slaves that ended up in the New World predominantly came from West and Central Africa, because Europeans were able to successfully take over the Canary Islands, Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, Bioko and Annobon, and controlled the oceans between and around them with naval ships as early as the 15th century. On the flip side, European control of the islands in the Indian Ocean, such as the Seychelles and Madagascar, didn't occur until as late as the 18th and 19th century, just as the slave trade was subsiding and being made illegal. Today, these islands stand at an intersection between Africa and the world, serving as a reminder of external influences on Africa and Africa's impact on the external world. Without these islands, it's entirely possible that the successes Europe and the Western world at large achieved in the New World would have been very limited. They would have had to establish bases on the African mainland and contend with hostilities from the local population instead of using the islands as proxies for the slave trade and resource extraction. A scenario like this would have diminished their ability to project and maintain power in their empire creation projects in the New World. A fact that became evident when European powers began formally colonizing the mainland of Africa in the 19th century and lost it all less than a century later due to hostilities and pressures from colonized Africans on the mainland. Some European countries still maintain control of some of these islands and use them as military bases that allows them to project power in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean to safeguard their maritime and political interests. Réunion and Mayotte, for instance, are French overseas territories, and their strategic proximity to the Mozambique Channel allows France to secure its shipping routes within the Channel and the Indian Ocean. It also provides them with a geopolitical chip to use in negotiations with other countries sailing through or near their waters. The same can be said of the Canary Islands, owned by Spain and strategically located between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The role these islands will play in the future is uncertain, but they will undeniably play a significant role as they have in the past and the present.